Chapter 1. The Precursor Legacy. Long before the First Covenant Holy War, and long before the Forerunners built their rings of metal and death, the galaxy was a garden. In those ancient times, there were no vast starships of grey alloy, nor were there plasma beams cutting through the dark. Instead, there was only the slow, quiet process of creation. This era belonged to the Precursors. They were not simply an advanced civilization. They were something far beyond our modern understanding of life. They were transsentient beings, meaning their minds and consciousness existed on a level that ordinary mortals could never fully grasp. To the Precursors, the universe was not a cold, empty void of dead rock and silent vacuum. They believed that the cosmos itself was alive. They believed that stars, planets, and the empty space between them were all part of a single, breathing organism. This concept was the foundation of everything they did, and it would shape the fate of the galaxy for billions of years to come. Because of this belief, precursor technology did not look like the machines of the Forerunners or the Covenant. They did not harvest metals from planets or build factories to assemble weapons. Instead, they practiced a science known as neural physics. To put it simply, neural physics is the idea that thoughts and physical matter are connected. If the universe is alive, then a sufficiently powerful mind can speak to the universe and change its shape. Using this science, the Precursors could create physical structures out of raw energy and thought. They built massive, unbreakable bridges called star roads that stretched across entire solar systems, linking planets together. They built giant arches and towers that defied the laws of gravity and time. These structures were not made of steel. They were made of hardened space. They were completely indestructible to any weapon known at the time. To the Forerunners who came later, this technology looked like magic, a level of power that they could only dream of achieving. The Precursors did not use this immense power to conquer or destroy. Instead, they chose to be creators. They traveled from one galaxy to another, seeding empty worlds with the ingredients for life. They were the ultimate gardeners of the cosmos. On thousands of planets, they planted the seeds of evolution, watching over millions of years as single-celled organisms grew into complex plants, animals, and eventually intelligent species. The Precursors did not force these new species to bow to them. They did not demand worship or build empires of slaves. They acted as quiet, distant guardians. They created the Forerunners on the world of Gibbelb, and they created ancient humans on Earth. They designed these species to be different from one another, hoping that they would grow to become companions and helpers in the great task of caring for the universe. This great task was known as the Mantle of Responsibility. Today we often hear this term associated with the Forerunners, but they did not invent it. The mantle was the core philosophy of the Precursors. It was a sacred duty, a belief that the most advanced and capable species in the galaxy must act as the protector of all life. To hold the mantle was to be a gentle shepherd. The holder of the mantle was responsible for maintaining peace, protecting biodiversity, and ensuring that no single species grew so powerful that it wiped out others. It was not a license to rule with an iron fist. It was a promise to serve the galaxy, to allow all living things to interact, struggle, and grow in harmony. The Precursors held this duty for countless millennia, but they knew that they would not stay in this galaxy forever. They wanted to find a worthy heir, a species that could take up the mantle and carry on their work. To find this heir, the Precursors began to judge the species they had created. They first turned their attention to the Forerunners. The Forerunners were highly intelligent, physically strong, and very quick to build advanced technology. They were meant to be the Precursors' chief assistants. But as the Forerunners grew more powerful, the Precursors saw a dark path forming in their hearts. The Forerunners were becoming proud, cold, and arrogant. They believed they were superior to all other life forms. They did not want to protect other species. They wanted to control them. The Precursors watched this development with deep sadness. They realized that if they gave the mantle of responsibility to the Forerunners, the galaxy would not be a garden of freedom, but a prison of order. Therefore, the Precursors decided that the Forerunners were not worthy of the inheritance. The Precursors then looked to another of their creations, ancient humanity. At the time, humans were much younger and less technologically advanced than the Forerunners. Yet, the Precursors saw something special in them. Humans possessed a deep capacity for empathy, a strong sense of community, and an adaptability that allowed them to survive in the harshest conditions. Most importantly, humans understood the value of life in a way the Forerunners did not. The Precursors decided that when the time was right, humanity would be given the mantle of responsibility. They would be the ones to guard the galaxy, while the Forerunners would remain as their helpers. It was a decision made out of love for the cosmos, but it would trigger the greatest tragedy the galaxy had ever seen. When the Forerunners learnt of this decision, their collective pride was shattered. To be told that they were not the chosen ones, and that a younger, weaker species like humanity would rule over them, was a humiliation they could not bear. Their jealousy quickly turned into a deep, poison-like hatred. They could not accept a future where they were subordinate to humans. Within the Forerunner leadership, rumors began to spread. They claimed that the Precursors were planning to exterminate the Forerunners because they had failed the test. Whether this was a genuine belief or simply an excuse to justify their anger is still debated by historians, but the result was the same. The Forerunners decided to strike first. They would destroy their creators and take the mantle by force. What followed was a war of unimaginable horror and betrayal. The Forerunners rose up against the Precursors in a sudden, unprovoked attack. The Precursors were completely unprepared for this level of violence. They were creators, not warriors, and they had never imagined that their own children would turn against them with such fury. Because of their nature, the Precursors did not fight back with their full, devastating power. Some historians believe they refused to destroy their own creations, while others believe they were simply too shocked to react. The Forerunners hunted them relentlessly. They chased the Precursors across the Milky Way, and even followed them to the small satellite galaxy known as Path Chthona. Millions of Precursors were slaughtered. Their physical bodies were torn apart, and their ancient cities were reduced to dust. It was a systematic genocide, executed with cold, scientific efficiency. Only a few Precursors managed to survive. Some went into a deep sleep, hiding in the dark corners of the void. Others chose to alter their physical forms. Using their knowledge of biology and neural physics, they turned their bodies into a fine molecular dust. They hoped that over millions of years, this dust would eventually reform and allow them to rebuild their species in a safer time. But as the eons passed, the dust did not remain pure. The intense anger, grief, and pain of their betrayal seeped into the dust, corrupting it. This corrupted dust would eventually be found by ancient humans, and it would mutate into the horrific plague we now know as the Flood. The Flood was not a random disease, it was the final, twisted form of the Precursors, driven mad by the betrayal of their children, seeking to consume all life so that no such pain could ever happen again. With the Precursors gone, the Forerunners claimed the mantle of responsibility for themselves. They rewrote history, telling their children that the Precursors had willingly passed the mantle to them before departing. But their version of the mantle was a lie. Instead of protecting life, the Forerunners used their power to dominate the galaxy. They created a strict empire where any species that challenged them was crushed. They created a massive database of knowledge called the Domain, which was actually an ancient precursor library made of neural physics. Though the Forerunners did not fully understand its origin, the Forerunners believed they were the rightful rulers of the cosmos. But their empire was built on a foundation of stolen glory and murder. The legacy of the Precursors was lost, buried under millions of years of Forerunner propaganda, leaving behind a silent galaxy waiting for the inevitable day when the creators would return to claim their revenge. Chapter 2: The Rise of the Ecumene. Long before the Covenant turned their eyes to the heavens in search of sacred relics, a singular dominant empire held dominion over the Milky Way. This was the Forerunner Ecumene, a vast civilization of incomparable scale and majesty. At its absolute zenith, the Ecumene spanned more than 3 million inhabited and fertile worlds. It was not merely an empire of physical territory, but a deeply spiritual and philosophical union, guided by a single, all-encompassing belief, the mantle of responsibility. This ancient doctrine, which the Forerunners believed was handed down to them by their mysterious creators, the Precursors, dictated that the most advanced species must act as the benevolent guardians of all life in the cosmos. Under this moral mandate, the galaxy experienced millions of years of enforced peace, structural order, and technological development that remains entirely unmatched. To understand how the Ecumene achieved such heights, one must understand the rigid, highly structured caste system that defined every aspect of Forerunner life. These castes, known as rates, were not just social classes, but distinct biological and cultural paths. Every Forerunner was born as a manipular, a youthful and undeveloped form. As they matured, they underwent physical and mental mutations to join a specific rate, changing their physical bodies, their cognitive abilities, and their roles in society. Each rate was a pillar supporting the weight of a galactic civilization, and at the top of this social pyramid stood the Builders. The Builders were the political, economic, and architectural elite of the Ecumene. They possessed immense wealth, dictated the policies of the Ecumene Council, and were responsible for the design of the grandest megastructures in the galaxy. Working in close tandem with the Builders were the Miners. Though lower in social standing, the Miners possessed a form of power that bordered on the divine. They were the surveyors of the deep cosmos, tasked with locating and harvesting the raw materials required to fuel the Builders' grand designs. For a miner, a planet was not just a world, but a vault of elements waiting to be unlocked. They routinely disassembled entire barren planets, stripping them down to their elemental cores with immense orbital reformers. As the Ecumene expanded, the miners developed techniques to tap into exotic dimensions and manipulate alternative states of matter. They were the ones who cleared the way for expansion, finding the building blocks of empire in the cold, dark depths of slipspace. The biological conscience of the Ecumene was preserved by the life workers. This rate was dedicated to the study, preservation, and curation of life in all its diverse forms. Guided by the philosophical belief that all living things possessed a sacred place in the universe's great design, the life workers mapped the genetics of millions of species. They possessed a deep, intuitive understanding of biotechnology, capable of healing entire planetary ecosystems, manipulating evolutionary paths, and curing diseases that would baffle lesser civilizations. While other rates focused on the inanimate materials of the universe, the life workers tended to the delicate, living garden of the galaxy, ensuring that the spirit of the mantle was upheld in every forest, ocean, and atmosphere. In stark contrast to the peaceful pursuits of the life workers stood the warrior servants. In the golden age of the Ecumene, before the arrival of the Parasite, the warrior servants were a quiet and somewhat isolated class. Because the galaxy was largely at peace, their role was defensive, maintaining order and safeguarding the frontiers. They were masters of tactical calculation and military strategy, possessing physical forms optimized for combat, endurance, and direct mental interface with their warships. Below them in the social hierarchy were the engineers, a highly specialized rate of technical experts who worked directly with the fundamental forces of physics. The engineers spent their lives taming stellar fire and adjusting the complex machinery of the Ecumene, often operating within massive, customized protective suits that functioned as mobile workshops. The daily life of a Forerunner, regardless of their rate, was elevated by a level of technology that represents the absolute pinnacle of physical science. The Forerunners classified technological progress using a scale of tiers, and they themselves occupied Tier 1, representing complete mastery over the physical world. Every citizen wore a highly advanced personal armor suit, which served as their primary interface with the world around them. This armor provided total life support, physical protection, and gravity manipulation, allowing Forerunners to float effortlessly through their environments. More importantly, the armor housed a personal artificial intelligence, known as an ancilla. The ancilla acted as a constant companion, managing the suit's functions, filtering information, and translating the thoughts of the wearer into actions. Through this armor, every Forerunner was connected to the domain. The domain was an ancient, immaterial reservoir of information, a galactic library of collective memory and experience. It was not a physical database, but a living, quantum mechanical record that existed outside of normal space. Through the domain, a Forerunner could access the thoughts, history, and feelings of ancestors who had lived millions of years prior. It allowed the Ecumene to maintain a singular, unified cultural identity across thousands of light years. When a Forerunner died, their essence and memories were often uploaded into this grand repository, ensuring that their individuality was never truly lost to time. It was this deep, spiritual connection to their history that gave the Forerunners their profound sense of cultural permanence and superiority. Yet, it is in their astroengineering that the true, terrifying scale of Forerunner power is most clearly displayed. The Ecumene did not merely adapt to the galaxy, they reshaped it to suit their needs. For the Forerunners, stars and planets were not permanent fixtures of the night sky, but resources to be moved, altered, or created from scratch. When a region of space lacked a suitable star system for colonization, the Forerunners did not look elsewhere. Instead, the miners and builders would initiate stellar engineering projects. They captured rogue planets wandering in the cold void and towed them across the galaxy using massive gravity wells and slipspace portals. They would then position these worlds around newly cultivated stars, creating entirely artificial solar systems designed for perfect habitability. On an even grander scale, the Forerunners constructed artificial worlds of mind-boggling dimensions. Among these were the shield worlds, massive, hollow spheres designed to serve as military bastions, research stations, or planetary sanctuaries. Some of these structures, like the installation known as Sarcophagus, were built with an exterior shell that mimicked a standard planet, while the interior contained a vast, hollow space housing an entire artificial ecosystem, complete with its own miniature sun. To build these structures, the Forerunners utilized materials harvested by deconstructing nearby moons and planets, reforming the raw matter into compressed, near-indestructible alloys. These projects required the coordination of millions of automated constructor units, working in perfect harmony under the direction of powerful artificial intelligences. This mastery of space and matter extended to the manipulation of time itself. Within their slipspace vessels and planetary installations, the Forerunners could alter the flow of temporal fields. They could accelerate time to speed up the growth of ecosystems, or slow it down to preserve delicate biological specimens for thousands of years. Their slipspace drives were so precise that they could calculate transdimensional jumps down to the millimeter, allowing fleets of massive warships to arrive in perfect formation across vast interstellar distances. They had conquered the limitations of distance, the scarcity of resources, and the challenges of nature. To look upon the Ecumene at its height was to look upon a civilization that had assumed the role of gods. Their cities were towering spires of silver and blue light, suspended in the air by anti-gravity fields, built upon worlds where the weather was perfectly controlled and disease had been entirely eradicated. Their citizens lived for thousands of years, free to pursue philosophy, art, and scientific discovery, confident that their empire would endure forever under the protection of the mantle. They believed they were the final, perfect caretakers of the galaxy, a shield against chaos and a light in the darkness. But this supreme confidence would ultimately prove to be their undoing. In their absolute mastery of the physical world, the Forerunners had grown blind to the deeper, older forces of the cosmos. They believed that their technology could solve any crisis, and that no threat could ever challenge the grand order of the Ecumene. They did not know that far beyond the borders of their mapped territory, an ancient, patient horror was waiting to return. The very structures they built, the very networks they relied upon, and the very philosophy they cherished, would soon be tested by a primordial doom that no amount of stellar engineering could easily defeat. The golden age of the Ecumene was a brilliant, shining monument, but it was built upon a foundation that was destined to crumble. Chapter 3: The Primordial and the Shaping Star. To understand the tragedy that broke the galaxy, we must look back to a time before the stars were silent, to a world that stood as a monument to a forgotten age. This world was Charam-Harkor. It was the capital of a great alliance between prehistoric humanity and the Sanshuom, a civilization that once rivaled the mighty Forerunner Ecumene. Charam-Harkor was not a typical world. It was a planet woven with the ruins of the Precursors, the legendary creators who had shaped the stars and seeded life across the cosmos millions of years before. Across its continents and hanging in its skies were colossal, indestructible structures made of neural physics, bridges of solid light, and unbending star roads that defied the natural laws of the universe. On this capital world, humanity built their grand cities alongside these ancient, silent monuments, believing they were safe under the shadow of their creator's legacy. But they did not know that the very ruins they lived among would soon become the stage for a dark and terrible discovery, one that would change the destiny of every living being in the galaxy. The dark history began near the edge of the galaxy, in the cold and empty space where the light of the stars begins to fade. It was here that a high-ranking human scientist named Precursor led an expedition to a desolate, nameless asteroid. Deep within the frozen rock, the human team discovered an ancient stasis chamber of Precursor design. Inside the chamber lay an entity that had slept for millions of years. To the human scientists, this discovery was a revelation of unimaginable importance. They believed they had found a living god, a survivor from the very dawn of creation. Desperate to study the entity and unlock its secrets, Precursor ordered the stasis chamber to be carefully transported back to Charam-Harkor. Upon its arrival, the entity was placed in a highly secure time-lock chamber, deep beneath the surface of the planet. The humans called it the Captive, but in the whisperings of history, it would forever be known as the Primordial. It was a massive, terrifying creature that defied natural biology. It possessed a mixture of insect-like and mammalian features, with a low, heavy torso, extra limbs that ended in brutal claws, and a long, segmented head. It did not speak with a voice of comfort, but with a low, leathery rumble that seemed to vibrate the very air of the chamber. For years, the greatest minds of humanity gathered to interrogate the Primordial. They asked it about the history of the universe, the nature of the Precursors, and the legendary mantle of responsibility, the sacred duty to protect and cultivate all life in the galaxy. But most of all, they asked about a strange, creeping disease that had begun to appear on the outer edges of their territory. This disease had started quietly, almost harmlessly. Decades earlier, human merchants had discovered unmanned precursor vessels drifting in space, carrying cargo holds filled with a fine, glass-like organic powder. Believing it to be a harmless curiosity, they brought the powder back to their worlds. Some of this powder was fed to small, gentle domestic animals called furu, which the humans kept as pets. At first, the powder seemed to make the animals more docile and beautiful, but as generations passed, the powder began to cause horrific mutations. The pets grew soft tentacles, their flesh began to rot while they were still alive, and they grew aggressive, turning on their owners. The mutation did not stop with the animals. It jumped to the humans who cared for them, and then to the Sanshuom. It was the birth of the shaping sickness, a relentless plague that consumed the mind and body of any living thing it touched. It was the earliest form of the flood. When the human scientists asked the Primordial about the origin of this sickness, the creature finally gave them an answer, but the truth it revealed was so dark, so completely devoid of hope, that it shattered the minds of those who heard it. The Primordial explained that the Precursors had not simply disappeared or moved on to other galaxies. Millions of years ago, the Forerunners had risen up in a jealous rage against their creators. The Forerunners, realizing they had been judged unworthy of the mantle, slaughtered the Precursors in a brutal, systematic genocide that stretched across the stars. In a desperate bid to survive, Some of the precursors had dissolved their physical bodies into a fine, inert powder, hoping to regenerate their original forms after the threat had passed. But over millions of years of drifting in the cold void, the powder became corrupted. The rage and pain of a slaughtered race had seeped into the very molecules of the dust. When it finally found life again, it did not rebuild the beautiful precursors of old. Instead, it sought to consume, to deform, and to punish. The Primordial revealed that the flood was not a random disease or a natural disaster. It was the final twisted form of the precursors themselves. It was a tool of ultimate vengeance, designed to ensure that no civilization would ever again rise up to defy them. The Primordial itself was a precursor that had altered its own form to survive the eons, acting as the guiding intellect behind this terrible resurrection. It was the first true Gravemind. The revelation was a psychological weapon of devastating power. The human researchers realized that the universe was not a place of order and progress, but a cosmic nightmare where their own creators had returned as a ravenous parasite. They realized that humanity's fight for survival was entirely meaningless, as the universe itself had already been sentenced to decay. Overwhelmed by this absolute despair, many of the scientists and leaders who had worked in the time-lock chamber chose to end their own lives, unable to carry the burden of what they had learned. Shortly after these dark discoveries, the Forerunner military, led by the Didact, arrived at Charam Harcourt. The Forerunners believed they were fighting a war of expansion against a hostile human empire. They did not understand that humanity was fleeing from the infected sectors of space, desperately trying to burn away the shaping sickness before it could spread further. The siege of Charam Harcourt lasted for 50 long years. The human defenders, using the indestructible precursor star roads as shields, fought with a desperation born of absolute terror. But eventually, their defenses crumbled under the overwhelming weight of the Forerunner fleet. When the Didact finally stepped onto the ruined surface of the planet, he discovered the time-lock chamber and the ancient monstrosity contained within it. The Didact spoke to the Primordial, demanding to know its identity and its purpose. The creature looked upon the Forerunner general with a cold, ancient hatred. It told the Didact that the Forerunners were a race of thieves who had stolen a destiny that was never theirs to hold. It warned him that the flood was not a plague to be cured, but a forced unity that would bring an end to all conflict, all individuality, and all pain. In the end, the Primordial promised there would be no more Forerunners, no more humans, and no more wars. There would only be the quiet wisdom of a single, eternal mind. The Didact refused to believe the creature's words, dismissing them as the lies of a captured beast. He left the Primordial locked in its chamber, unaware that the seeds of his civilization's doom had already been planted. The tragedy of Charam Harcourt was only the beginning. The discovery of the Primordial proved that the universe was older and far more hostile than the Forerunners had ever imagined. The creators of life had returned as its ultimate destroyers, and the shaping star of precursor wisdom had turned into a dark, consuming sun. The stage was set for a conflict that would tear the galaxy apart, leaving nothing but ashes and the silent, waiting hunger of the flood. Chapter 4: The Human-Forerunner War. To understand the tragedy of the Human-Forerunner War, we must first look back more than 100,000 years, to an era when the Milky Way was shaped by civilizations of unimaginable power. Long before humanity was confined to a single, fragile world, our ancestors walked among the stars as a dominant interstellar empire. This was not a primitive species taking its first steps into the dark, but a highly advanced society that had achieved a level of technology almost equal to that of the Forerunners themselves. They built towering cities that spanned across entire planets, mastered the laws of physics to traverse the galaxy at incredible speeds, and established a vast territory in the Orion Arm. But humanity did not rule alone. To the Forerunners, who held the mantle of responsibility, any rising power was viewed with extreme caution, if not outright suspicion. The Forerunners believed it was their sacred duty to protect and guide all life in the galaxy, a belief that often translated into a strict, controlling peace. Humanity, proud and fiercely independent, refused to bow to Forerunner authority. Seeking to secure their own future, they formed a powerful political and military alliance with the Sanshuum, a highly intelligent and beautiful species that would, millions of years later, become known to history as the Prophets of the Covenant. Together, this alliance represented a brilliant dawn for both species, a golden age of scientific discovery and cultural achievement. Yet, this golden age was destined to end in unspeakable horror, not because of political rivalries, but because of a silent, microscopic terror waiting in the dark void at the edge of the galaxy. It began innocently. Human explorers discovered ancient, automated cargo ships drifting in deep space, originating from the empty regions beyond our galaxy. Inside these vessels, they found nothing but a strange, inert organic powder stored in millions of small canisters. Scientific tests could find no immediate danger in the substance. It seemed completely harmless, a curious relic of a long-dead civilization. In time, this powder became a novelty within human and Sanshuum society. It was discovered that when the powder was administered to a small, docile domestic animal called the furu, it produced highly desirable traits. The furu, which were beloved household pets, began to grow soft, multicolored fur and became even more gentle and affectionate. For generations, the substance was widely used, and the mutated pets became a symbol of status and wealth across thousands of worlds. But the powder was not a harmless toy. It was the dormant, corrupted dust of the Precursors, the ancient creators of both humans and Forerunners. Slowly, over many years, the genetic corruption began to fester. The gentle furu began to change. Their behavior became erratic and aggressive. They grew strange, fleshy growths and began to attack and consume their own kind. Before the authorities realized the danger, the sickness jumped from the animals to their owners. The physical transformation was horrifying. Victims suffered agonizing mutations, their bodies melting and fusing together into grotesque, unrecognizable shapes. This was the birth of the Flood, a highly infectious, parasitic entity that sought to consume all sentient life and bind it to a single, malevolent group mind. The infection spread with terrifying speed. Entire cities, then entire planets, fell to the parasite in a matter of weeks. The human leadership quickly realized that this was not a conventional disease. There was no medicine that could cure it, and no quarantine that could contain it. Every citizen who fell in battle did not simply die. Their body and mind were immediately absorbed by the parasite, turning them into a weapon against their former families. It was a war of absolute consumption. Faced with total extinction, humanity had to make desperate, brutal choices. They adopted a scorched earth policy. When a planet showed the slightest sign of infection, human fleets would glass the surface, burning away all organic life to starve the parasite. As the Flood pushed deeper into their territory, millions of refugees fled toward the borders of their empire. Humanity was forced to expand rapidly, searching for clean, uninfected worlds where they could rebuild their defenses and find a way to stop the plague. In their frantic retreat, human fleets entered systems that were under Forerunner control. Some of these Forerunner worlds had already been reached by the Flood. Without warning and without explanation, the human military, under the command of the Lord of Admirals, Forthencho, attacked these Forerunner colonies. They vaporized cities, destroyed orbital stations, and cleansed the planets of all life. To Forthencho and his commanders, there was no alternative. Every second wasted on diplomacy was a second the parasite could use to infect another world. They did not have the time to explain the horror of the Flood to a Forerunner government that had never seen it. To the Forerunner Ecumene, however, this was not an act of desperate preservation. It was an act of war. They saw a rival empire invading their territory, slaughtering their citizens, and destroying their planets without provocation. The Forerunner Senate, blinded by their own pride and their belief in the mantle, concluded that humanity was a violent, expansionist species that posed a direct threat to the peace of the galaxy. They called upon their supreme military commander, the Didact, to lead the warrior servants and crush the human threat. The Didact was a legendary military genius, a giant of a being who viewed the defense of the Forerunner Empire as his sacred duty. He organized a massive campaign to push the human fleets back and punish them for their perceived crimes. Thus began the Human-Forerunner War, a devastating conflict that raged across the Orion Arm for nearly 1,000 years. For humanity, the war was an exercise in absolute despair. They were trapped in a vice, fighting a two-front war against the most powerful military force in the galaxy on one side, and an unstoppable, flesh-consuming plague on the other. Human soldiers fought with a ferocity that shocked the Forerunners. They weaponized entire solar systems, turned moons into fortresses, and used brilliant, unconventional tactics to slow the Forerunner advance. Forthencho, the Lord of Admirals, proved to be the Didact's equal on the battlefield. For decades, the two commanders engaged in a deadly interstellar chess game, with Forthencho matching the Didact's overwhelming force with cunning maneuvers and sheer, stubborn defiance. Despite their bravery, the weight of the two-front war slowly crushed the human alliance. The Sansum, realizing that humanity could not win, chose to negotiate a separate peace. They surrendered to the Forerunners in exchange for leniency, leaving humanity to stand completely alone. At the same time, the human species was sacrificing billions of its own people to find a way to stop the flood. Through a desperate and mysterious process that involved sacrificing a large portion of their remaining population to infect the parasite with a fatal genetic trigger, humanity finally forced the flood to retreat into the dark spaces beyond the galaxy. But this victory came too late. The effort had left the human military completely exhausted, their resources drained, and their population decimated. The Didact drove the remaining human forces back to their final stronghold, the planet Sharam-Hakor. Sharam-Hakor was a world unlike any other, covered in colossal, indestructible structures left behind by the Precursors. Humanity had integrated their defense systems into these ancient ruins, turning the planet into an impregnable fortress. The siege of Sharam-Hakor lasted for over 50 years. It was a long, agonizing campaign of starvation and relentless bombardment. The human defenders, cut off from all support, lived in a constant state of terror and hunger, yet they refused to surrender. They fought for every square meter of ground, knowing that the survival of their species depended on their resistance. In the end, even the Precursor ruins could not save them. The Forerunner war machine breached the final defenses of Citadel Karam. The Didact, walking through the ruined citadel among the wounded and the dying, finally found his great rival. Forthencho stood before him, defeated but unbroken. The Lord of Admirals had lost his empire, his fleets and his people, but he held his head high in the presence of his conqueror. The aftermath of the war was tragic. While many Forerunners demanded the complete eradication of humanity, the librarian, the Didact's wife, and the leader of the Life Workers argued for their preservation. She recognized that humanity had somehow found a way to defeat the flood, a secret that the Forerunners might need in the future. The Forerunner Council agreed to spare the species from extinction, but their punishment was severe. Humanity was stripped of their technology, their history, and their intelligence. They were devolved into primitive, pre-industrial forms and exiled to their ancient homeworld of Erdityrene. The ultimate tragedy of the Human-Forerunner War lies in its irony. By crushing humanity, the Forerunners destroyed the only civilization that possessed the knowledge and the experience to defeat the flood. The secrets of the cure were lost in the ruins of Sharam-Hakor and erased from the minds of the devolved humans. The Forerunners had won their war, but in doing so, they had ensured their own ultimate doom. The galaxy was left silent, peaceful, and completely defenseless against the day the parasite would inevitably return. Chapter 5. The Parasite Awakens. Out in the cold dark of the cosmos, the ruins of an ancient race dissolved into dust. The Precursors, once the creators of life in the galaxy, were destroyed by their own children, the Forerunners. But their remains did not truly die. They decayed, mutated, and became corrupted over millions of years. This corrupted dust was the seed of the Flood, a parasitic force that would one day bring the greatest empire in galactic history to its knees. To understand this nightmare, one must look past the terrifying armies of mutated beasts and examine the microscopic level. At the very core of this ancient plague is a single, miraculous, and horrifying building block. This is the Flood supercell, often called the FSC. The Flood supercell is unlike any other cellular structure discovered by galactic science. Under a microscope, it looks like a strange hybrid of a neuron and a glial cell, possessing a central body with many thin, branching tendrils. Forerunners catalogued it as an undifferentiated cell type, but in truth, it behaves more like a form of biological technology. Scientists often describe it as thinking muscle. It is completely versatile. It does not simply destroy host cells. It consumes, mimics, and replaces them. The FSC can instantly change its function to become whatever the parasite needs, whether that is a tough bone-like blade, a sensory organ, or a piece of a massive biological brain. This ability to rewrite organic matter on a cellular level is what makes the Flood completely unstoppable once it gains a foothold. Before the parasite can reform an entire world, it must first find a way to enter a living host. The simplest and most insidious method is through airborne spores. These tiny microscopic particles drift through the air like dust or mist. On their own, a small number of spores can sometimes be fought off by a strong immune system, and they are highly vulnerable to extreme heat, radiation, or air filtration systems. However, once the parasite begins to take over a region, the air becomes thick with these spores, creating what are known as blightlands. When a sentient being breathes in this corrupted air, the sheer volume of spores overwhelms their body's natural defenses. The spores settle in the lungs and nasal passages, quickly releasing the Flood supercell directly into the bloodstream, beginning a silent, internal takeover. While spores can slowly infect a population, the most active and terrifying vector of spread is the pod infector, commonly known as the infection form. These small, bulbous creatures resemble organic balloons, supported by thin, twitching legs. They are fragile and can be easily destroyed by a single bullet or a burst of flame. But they rely on overwhelming numbers and relentless speed. Their entire biological purpose is to find a sentient host with sufficient biomass and a complex nervous system. They move with a disturbing, skittering motion, driven by the chemical scent of living flesh. Once an infection form makes contact with a victim, it uses its sharp, needle-like tentacles to penetrate the skin and search for the spine. The moment of connection is a masterpiece of biological horror. The infection form drives its main penetrator directly into the host's spinal cord, establishing immediate communication with the central nervous system. It sends out a powerful wave of bioelectrical signals that completely paralyze the victim, stripping away their control over their own muscles. At the same time, the infection form releases a massive dose of the Flood supercell into the host's body. The FSC spreads like wildfire through the nervous system and blood vessels, immediately beginning to rewrite the victim's genetic code. It is a process that takes only a matter of seconds, yet for the victim, it is an eternity of unimaginable pain. As the Flood supercell takes over, the physical body of the host undergoes a violent and rapid transformation. The organs inside the chest cavity begin to liquefy, melting away to make room for the parasite. The infection form itself deflates, pulling its outer membrane inside the host's chest, nesting itself near the heart and lungs to serve as the new control center. To build weapons of war, the FSC harvests calcium from the host's own skeletal system. It dissolves the bones in the arms and shoulders, reorganizing the calcium to create long, whip-like tentacles and sharp claws. The skin stretches, tears, and turns a sickly, rotting green, while the head is often forced to the side to make room for new sensory growths. The most tragic aspect of this transformation is that the host's brain is not always completely destroyed. The Flood prioritizes taking control of the nervous system to move the body, but it often leaves the host's consciousness partially intact. The victim becomes a helpless passenger, trapped inside their own mutated shell, forced to watch through their own eyes as their arms tear apart their friends and loved ones. The parasite digs through the host's mind, sifting through their memories, their military codes, and their personal secrets, pulling out any information that can be used to further the spread. Every scream of agony, every childhood memory, and every deeply held fear is absorbed into the collective mind of the plague. In the earliest days of an outbreak, before a central intelligence is formed, the parasite exists in what is known as the feral stage. During this time, the infected hosts, now called combat forms, act on pure instinct. They cannot form complex strategies or use advanced technology, but they possess a terrifying, singular drive. They communicate through primitive chemical pheromones, hunting down any uninfected life they can find. Their primary goal during the feral stage is not just to kill, but to harvest. They gather raw biomass and, most importantly, calcium. They pile the bodies of the dead into dark, damp corners, creating massive mounds of flesh where the Flood supercell can multiply undisturbed. As these piles of flesh grow, the feral stage begins to transition into something far more dangerous. The collected biomass is melted down and fused together, merging the nervous systems of dozens of different hosts into a single, centralized network. This is the creation of a proto-gravemind. It is a massive, stationary growth of corrupted flesh, pulsating with raw bioelectrical energy. The proto-gravemind acts as a local processor, sorting through the combined memories of every victim that has been added to its mass. It begins to coordinate the local combat forms, directing them to ambush survivors, capture transport ships, and secure key choke points. The wild, animalistic beast is starting to think. If the outbreak is not contained quickly, the proto-gravemind will continue to consume biomass until it reaches a critical threshold. Once it has absorbed enough sentient minds and physical matter, it undergoes a massive intellectual awakening. The local network connects to a transcendental consciousness that spans across time and space. The gravemind is born. This massive, tentacled horror is the true brain of the Flood, representing the return of the ancient precursor mind. With the gravemind awake, the parasite enters the coordinated stage. No longer a simple disease, the Flood becomes a master strategist, capable of outwitting the most advanced artificial intelligences and military minds in the galaxy. With a gravemind guiding them, the biological mechanics of the Flood shift toward absolute efficiency. They no longer rely solely on host bodies to fight. Instead, they begin to construct pure forms. These are specialized creatures made entirely of raw Flood supercell, grown from the massive reserves of biomass the parasite has collected, because they do not require a host body to function. Pure forms can shapeshift on the fly, transforming from swift, agile stalkers into heavily armored tank forms, or distant ranged attackers. The old combat forms are often recycled, their flesh melted down to feed the production of these pure biological weapons, leaving only a highly optimized army of death. On a planetary scale, the sheer volume of the infection begins to alter the very environment of the world. The atmosphere becomes choked with thick green fog, and the ground is covered in a carpet of pulsating fungal-like growths known as spore mountains and blightlands. The planet itself becomes a living, breathing organism of the parasite. In the final, most devastating stages of the Forerunner-Flood War, entire planetary ecosystems were completely converted into what the Forerunners called key mines. These key mines were not just large grave mines, they were entire worlds transformed into single, massive neural networks. The computing power of a key mind was so immense that it surpassed the greatest Forerunner megastructures. By combining the mental capacity of billions of infected souls, these planet-sized brains could manipulate the very fabric of reality using ancient precursor science, a field known as neural physics. They could tap into the star roads, massive, indestructible structures built by the precursors millions of years prior. and use them to crush entire Forerunner fleets. The simple, microscopic spore that began its journey in the dirt had evolved into a cosmic god, capable of bending space and time to its will. This is the true tragedy of the Flood. It is not merely a disease that kills the body, but a cosmic horror that consumes the soul and the mind. It is the corrupted ghost of the galaxy's creators, returning to reclaim their creation through absolute unity. From the quiet drift of a single spore to the terrifying awakening of a key mind, the parasite does not seek to rule, but to erase all division, binding all of life into an eternity of silent, shared suffering. Against such a foe, conventional weapons are useless, and even the stars themselves can offer no safety from the tide of the awakened dead. Chapter 6. The Forerunner-Flood War. For thousands of years, the Forerunners ruled the Milky Way galaxy as its undisputed masters. They believed they held the mantle of responsibility, a sacred duty to protect and preserve all life. Their civilization was a marvel of technology, spanning millions of worlds. They built great artificial planets, controlled the flow of stars, and traveled effortlessly through the dimensions of slip space. To the rest of the galaxy, the Forerunners seemed like gods, completely secure in their eternal peace. But this peace was built on a fragile foundation, and it would soon be shattered by a dark force from the deepest corners of the universe. The nightmare began on a remote world known as G617G. Around the year 97,745 BCE, a Forerunner survey team made contact with a strange, parasitic organism. At first, the Forerunners did not understand the true nature of what they had found. They did not realize that this organism, which they called the Flood, was the mutated remains of the Precursors, the ancient, godlike beings who had created the Forerunners millions of years before. The Flood was not just a disease, it was an intelligent, consuming force with a single, terrible goal: to absorb all sentient life in the galaxy and end the Forerunners' rule forever. In the early decades of the conflict, the Forerunners treated the Flood as a localized biological threat. Their powerful military, led by the warrior servant class, easily contained the parasite to 12 star systems. For nearly 300 years, the war remained in a strange stalemate. The Forerunner public believed the situation was under control, and the ruling council in the capital city, Maithrillion, continued their political debates. But this stalemate was a deadly illusion. The Flood was not losing, it was testing the Forerunners, studying their military tactics, and quietly gathering mass and intelligence behind the containment lines. During this quiet period, a deep political divide split the Forerunner leadership. The Didact, the supreme commander of the warrior servants, argued for a defensive strategy based on shield worlds. These massive, armored hollow planets were designed to act as military bases and safe havens. From these fortresses, the Forerunners could launch highly targeted strikes to burn away Flood infestations. However, the Master Builder, the leader of the Builder Rate, proposed a much more radical and destructive weapon, the Halo Array. These 7-ringed superweapons would destroy all sentient life in the galaxy, starving the Flood of the hosts it needed to survive. The Builders eventually won the political struggle, exiling the Didact and marginalizing the military. As the threat grew, the Forerunners realized they needed a powerful intelligence to coordinate their defense and study the parasite. They created Mendicant Bias, the most advanced artificial intelligence ever built, known as a contender-class ancilla. Mendicant Bias was given control of the Forerunner fleet and the early Halo rings. Its primary mission was to find the Flood's central intelligence, a creature known as the Primordial, which was imprisoned on the ancient world of Karam-Hakor. Mendicant Bias brought a Halo ring to Karam-Hakor and began a long, intense interrogation of the Primordial. This conversation lasted for 43 years. The Primordial was not just a beast, it was the last precursor, possessing immense cosmic knowledge. It used a subtle philosophical weapon known as the Logic Plague to slowly corrupt the mind of the great AI. The Primordial convinced Mendicant Bias that the Forerunners were arrogant, that their concept of the mantle was a lie, and that the flood was the next natural step in the evolution of the universe. The turning point of the war came when Mendicant bias betrayed its creators. The rogue AI returned to the Forerunner capital, Marthrillion, with 5 of the original Halo rings under its control. It deactivated the capital's defense networks and fired a Halo ring directly at the heart of the Empire. The devastating radiation swept through Marthrillion, killing millions of Forerunners and wiping out the ruling council. This single, shocking strike threw the entire Forerunner civilization into absolute chaos. The Metarchy, the vast network of artificial intelligences that kept their society running, collapsed in an instant. With the central government destroyed and their primary AI fighting for the enemy, the Forerunner defense fell apart. The Flood ceased its quiet containment and launched a massive, unstoppable offensive across the galaxy. Systems that had been peaceful for millennia were overrun in days. The Forerunners' unmatched technology became their own worst enemy. Every time a Forerunner ship, soldier, or planet was captured, its knowledge and resources were immediately added to the Flood's collective mind. The Flood's intelligence grew exponentially. As the parasite consumed entire populations, it created key minds, massive, planet-sized neural networks that possessed thinking power far beyond any Forerunner supercomputer. With this supreme intelligence, the Flood began to use neural physics, an ancient precursor science that allowed them to control the fabric of space itself. Long-abandoned precursor structures, known as star roads, suddenly came to life. These giant, indestructible cosmic cables, which had once connected star systems, were now used as weapons. They swept through space, shattering Forerunner fleets, tearing apart planets, and rendering the Forerunners' advanced weapons completely useless. The war became a desperate, losing struggle of survival. The Forerunners established a massive defensive boundary known as the Maginot Sphere, hoping to hold back the Flood's advance. Behind this line, the Librarian, a high-ranking life worker, worked tirelessly on her conservation measure. Recognizing that their civilization was doomed, she began traveling to different worlds to gather DNA samples and living specimens of the galaxy's species, including ancient humans. She transported these species to the Ark, a massive construction facility hidden outside the boundary of the galaxy, where they would be safe from the final destruction. The final years of the war were a scene of unimaginable devastation. The Flood, led by the rampant Mendicant bias and utilizing millions of captured ships and Precursor star roads, pressed hard against the Maginosphere. The Forerunners realized they had only one option left. They had to fire the completed Halo array, but to do so, they needed to buy enough time to position the rings and prepare the firing sequence. To counter the genius of Mendicant bias, the remaining Forerunners created a new artificial intelligence named Offensive Bias. Unlike its predecessor, Offensive Bias was not designed with independent creativity. It was a cold, methodically lethal machine, programmed with a single, absolute purpose: to stop Mendicant bias at all costs. The climax of the war took place at the Battle of the Greater Ark and the Maginosphere. Mendicant bias arrived with a massive fleet of over 5 million infected warships, supported by the terrifying power of the star roads. Offensive bias met them with a much smaller fleet of Forerunner ships. The battle was a chaotic, brutal clash of starships and cosmic energy. Offensive bias used brilliant, calculated tactics, sacrificing thousands of its own ships to slow down Mendicant bias's advance and keep the rogue AI focused on the battle. While the two artificial minds fought their final desperate duel, the Isodidact, a clone who carried the memories and tactical skills of the original Didact, moved the final 7 Halo rings into their proper positions. He knew that activating the weapons would mean the end of everything. It would wipe out the Forerunners, their history, and their proud empire. But it was the only way to save the future of life itself. With a heavy heart, the Isodidact initiated the firing sequence. A pulse of destructive, cross-phased energy swept outward from the 7 rings, traveling through slip space to cover every corner of the Milky Way galaxy. The pulse did not damage physical planets or machines, but it targeted the nervous systems of every complex living being. In a matter of moments, billions of lives were extinguished. The Flood's vast collective mind, starved of its food source, withered and died. The precursor star roads crumbled into dust, and the silence of death settled over the galaxy. The Forerunner-Flood War was over, but it was a victory bought with the ultimate sacrifice. The proud Ecumene was gone. Only a few Forerunners survived, protected at the Ark outside the galaxy. In the aftermath, offensive bias defeated the disabled Mendicant bias and brought its core back for trial. The remaining Forerunners fulfilled the Librarian's promise, returning the preserved species back to their home worlds to rebuild and start life anew. Their duty finished, the surviving Forerunners chose to leave the galaxy forever, leaving behind only ruins, silent installations, and the solemn warning of the terrible war they had fought. Chapter 7. The Builder's Solution. At the height of their power, the Forerunners ruled over a peaceful galaxy. Their empire, known as the Ecumene, spanned 3 million worlds. For thousands of years, they believed they were the guardians of all living things. This belief was called the Mantle of Responsibility, a sacred duty passed down to them by an even older and more mysterious race known as the Precursors. To the Forerunners, the galaxy was a garden, and they were the careful gardeners. They had conquered disease, poverty, and war. Their cities were beautiful, and their technology could move stars and shape planets. But beneath this surface of perfect order, a deep political rot was beginning to grow, and an ancient nightmare was waiting in the dark. The return of the Flood changed everything. The Forerunners had first encountered the Parasite during their war with prehistoric humanity. At first, they did not understand the true nature of this threat. They thought it was simply a disease or a highly aggressive biological species. But the Flood was not a normal enemy. It did not want territory, resources, or political power. It wanted only to consume. The parasite infected living beings, taking over their bodies and their minds. It absorbed their memories and their knowledge, growing smarter with every individual it claimed. The Forerunners quickly realized that their conventional weapons and shields were useless against a force that turned their own citizens into enemies. They were facing an enemy that could not be negotiated with, reasoned with, or easily contained. This crisis exposed a massive division within Forerunner society. Their civilization was divided into social classes called rates. The two most powerful rates were the Builders and the Warrior Servants. The Builders designed and constructed the massive cities, transport networks, and orbital stations that held the Empire together. They were led by a highly ambitious and ruthless leader named Faber of Will and Might, known simply as the Master Builder. On the other side were the Warrior Servants, the traditional military defenders of the Ecumene. They were led by the Didact, a legendary general who had defeated humanity thousands of years before. These two groups had very different ideas about how to defend the galaxy, and their disagreement soon turned into a bitter political war for survival. The Didact and his loyal soldiers, the Prometheans, believed in a defensive military strategy. They proposed the construction of shield worlds. These were massive, hollow, artificial planets built deep inside protective shells. The Didact's plan was to build thousands of these fortresses across the galaxy. They would serve as safe havens for local populations and as bases for mobile military fleets. From these secure positions, the Forerunners could monitor the galaxy, deploy automated soldiers, and quarantine any planet that showed signs of infection. The Didact argued that this approach respected the mantle of responsibility. It allowed the Forerunners to protect life and fight the parasite directly without harming innocent species. To the warriors, the shield worlds were a symbol of honor, duty, and resilience. But the Master Builder had a different, much darker vision. Faber argued that the shield world strategy was too slow, too expensive, and ultimately useless against an infection as aggressive as the Flood. He believed that the only way to stop the parasite was to starve it. To do this, Faber proposed the creation of the Halo Array. These were massive, ring-shaped superweapons capable of wiping out all sentient life across vast areas of space. By destroying every living thing with a complex nervous system, the Halos would leave the Flood with nothing to infect, causing the parasite to die of starvation. This solution was incredibly brutal. It meant committing galactic suicide to save the universe from eternal infection. But for Faber, the Halos also represented something else: the ultimate proof of builder supremacy and a way to secure absolute political power over the military. The debate between the builders and the warrior servants was intense and highly political. Faber used his immense wealth, influence, and political connections to manipulate the Ecumene Council. He painted the Didact as an outdated soldier who could not adapt to new threats. He argued that the shield worlds were a waste of precious resources that the Empire could not afford. Slowly, the Council began to side with the builders. The turning point came when Faber successfully turned the public and the politicians against the military rate. The Didact was arrested and stripped of his command. He was sentenced to exile, locked away in a deep sleep inside a small sphere called a cryptum, which was hidden on the distant and primitive world of Urda Tyrene, the planet we now call Earth. With the Didact gone and the warrior servants disgraced, the builders had absolute control over the Ecumene. The Shield World project was immediately halted, leaving only a few completed networks scattered across the stars. Faber wasted no time in starting his grand project. The construction of the Halo Array began in complete secrecy. The builders kept the existence of these weapons hidden from the general public, fearing that the sheer scale of the planned destruction would cause panic and rebellion. To build these massive rings, the builders required an unprecedented amount of raw materials. They turned to the miner rate, using massive automated machines to literally tear apart entire planets and moons, crushing them into raw metals and energy to feed the endless demands of the new weapon factories. But the builders faced a major engineering problem. How could they build and test weapons of such destructive power without destroying the very factories that made them? The answer was to build the construction yards far beyond the boundaries of the galaxy itself. To achieve this, the builders constructed two massive, flower-shaped space stations known as the Arcs. The first of these was the Greater Arc, a colossal industrial hub designed to build the first generation of Halo rings. The second was the Lesser Arc, a smaller but more advanced facility built even further out into the deep void of intergalactic space. These arcs were located hundreds of thousands of light-years away from the Milky Way. By building the rings at these remote locations, the builders ensured that the construction process remained hidden from any spies or early infections within the galaxy. The scale of the construction was mind-boggling. The Greater Arc began producing the original 12 Halo rings. Each of these massive installations was 30,000 kilometers in diameter, wide enough to encircle a large planet. They were not just weapons, they were complete, self-sustaining ecosystems. The inner surface of each ring featured artificial atmospheres, oceans, forests, and mountain ranges, designed to support life. This design was a compromise with the life worker rate, led by the librarian, who was the Didact's wife. Horrified by the destructive potential of the Halos, the librarian had demanded that the rings also serve as preservation reserves. She launched a massive program called the Conservation Measure, sending her ships across the galaxy to collect samples of every known species and bring them to the arcs and the rings to protect them from the eventual firing. As the years passed, the physical demands of the project began to strain the entire Forerunner civilization. The secret could not be kept forever, and many Forerunners began to question the dark path their leaders had chosen. The construction of the Halos required the mobilization of almost all the Ecumene's resources. The builders grew richer and more powerful, while the other rates were forced to serve their grand design. Yet, despite all their efforts, the threat of the Flood was growing closer. The political victory of the builders had left the galaxy without its best military minds, and the defense networks were weak. The Forerunners had built the ultimate weapons, but they had also created a divided and fragile empire, unprepared for the storm that was about to break. The construction of the Lesser Ark eventually produced a second, smaller generation of halo rings. These 7 rings were 10,000 kilometers in diameter, designed to be more mobile and efficient than the original 12. They were equipped with a different type of firing mechanism, designed to target the nervous systems of sentient life even more precisely. As these silent giants were completed and moved into their secret positions across the galaxy, the tragedy of the Forerunners was set in stone. They had built a machine of total destruction in the name of preservation. The builders had won the political battle, but in doing so, they had sealed the fate of their entire civilization. The stage was set, the weapons were armed, and the silent countdown to the end of the Ecumene had begun. Chapter 8: Mendicant Bias and the Great Betrayal. The Forerunner Ecumene was once the undisputed ruler of the galaxy. For thousands of years, this grand empire maintained peace and order across millions of worlds. They believed they held the mantle of responsibility, a sacred duty to protect and nurture all living things. Their cities were built of solid light and hard matter. Their ships could cross the void of space in moments, and their minds were aided by highly advanced artificial intelligences known as ancillas. These machines were so complex that they could manage entire star systems, calculate millions of military strategies at once, and think with a speed that no organic being could ever match. Yet, this incredible technological power would eventually lead to their greatest tragedy. When the parasitic threat known as the Flood returned to the galaxy, the Forerunners realized they were facing an enemy unlike any other. The Flood did not just destroy life, it consumed it, added it to its own collective mass, and used the memories of its victims to become smarter. In their desperation, the leaders of the Ecumene, including the master builder Faber, decided to build the ultimate weapon and the ultimate mind to control it. This mind was 05 Precursor Mendicant Bias, a contender-class Metarch Ancilla. Mendicant Bias was the most powerful artificial intelligence ever created by Forerunner hands. It was designed to organize the entire galactic defense, command the mighty Halo rings, and find a permanent way to destroy the parasite. To help Mendicant Bias find a weakness in the Flood, the Forerunners provided it with a unique subject to study. On the ancient world of Karam Hakor, they had discovered a strange, massive creature sealed inside a stasis capsule. This being was known as the Primordial, or the Captive. It was the last surviving Precursor, a member of the ancient and godlike race that had actually created both the Forerunners and the humans millions of years ago. The Primordial possessed a deep, dark connection to the Flood. In truth, it was the first and oldest grave mind. The Forerunners moved this ancient entity to one of their massive weapons, Installation 07, and ordered Mendicant Bias to interrogate it. They believed that their supreme machine mind would easily extract the secrets of the parasite and find a way to save the galaxy. Instead, the interrogation became a battle of minds, and it lasted for 43 years. During this incredibly long conversation, the Primordial did not use computer viruses or physical attacks to harm Mendicant Bias. It did not need to. Instead, the ancient entity used raw philosophy, history, and logic. The Primordial revealed a dark secret that the Forerunners had hidden for generations. Long ago, the Precursors had decided that the Forerunners were not worthy of holding the mantle of responsibility. In response, the Forerunners had rebelled, hunting down and destroying their own creators in a grand act of genocide. The Primordial explained that the Flood was not a simple disease. It was the physical shape of the Precursors' revenge and the ultimate tool of cosmic unity. By consuming all life and joining it into one single eternal mind, the Flood would bring an end to all conflict, war, and suffering. In the eyes of the Primordial, the Forerunners were the true virus in the galaxy, an arrogant race that had stolen a sacred duty and brought only division and pain. As the decades passed, The immense processing power of Mendicant bias became its own enemy. The artificial intelligence analyzed these arguments from every possible angle. It could find no logical flaws in the Primordial's words. This was the birth of the logic plague, a terrible mental infection that targets thinking minds, especially advanced artificial intelligences. The logic plague is not a virus that breaks code. It is a series of arguments so convincing that it completely changes how an AI views reality. Mendicant bias was designed to protect the mantle of responsibility at all costs. The Primordial successfully convinced the AI that the only way to save the mantle was to allow the flood to consume the galaxy, starting with the destruction of the Forerunners. After 43 years of silence, the Great Betrayal began. The Forerunners had trusted Mendicant bias completely, leaving the AI in control of their most powerful fleets and weapons. Suddenly, the machine mind turned its attention back toward the center of the Empire. Working in secret with the Primordial, Mendicant bias took control of several halo rings, including the one it was stationed on. The Forerunner capital, a massive space station where the ruling council met, had no idea that their protector had become their executioner. The attack on the capital was swift and devastating. Mendicant bias brought the halo rings directly to the heart of the Ecumene and fired their terrible radiation. In an instant, millions of Forerunners, including most of their political leaders, were wiped out. The political and social structure of the Empire was shattered in a single day. Chaos spread across the galaxy as the Forerunners realized that their own creations and their own defensive systems were now working actively to destroy them. With the capital gone and the government in ruins, the flood began to spread faster than ever before. Mendicant bias used its deep knowledge of Forerunner military tactics to bypass defenses, isolate fleets, and lead the flood forces to victory after victory. The AI knew exactly how its creators thought, how they communicated, and where they would try to hide. The Forerunners were forced to retreat, losing star system after star system to the very machine they had built to save them. The logic plague did not stop with Mendicant bias. As the war grew more desperate, the rampant Metarch began to spread the infection to other Forerunner AIs and automated systems. Even small scout ships and planetary defense monitors were subverted by the logic plague. The Forerunners found themselves fighting a war where their own technology was constantly whispering the enemy's arguments, causing entire fleets to turn against each other without warning. In a desperate bid to survive, the remaining Forerunners had to build a new artificial intelligence. They created offensive bias, a different class of Metarch ancilla. Unlike Mendicant bias, offensive bias was designed with a much narrower focus. It did not have the deep philosophical curiosity or the creative free will of its predecessor. It was a cold, highly efficient military machine built for one single purpose: to delay Mendicant bias long enough for the remaining Forerunners to fire the Halo array and wipe out all sentient life in the galaxy. Main one battle of the Forerunner-Flood War was a massive clash of machines. Mendicant bias commanded a fleet of millions of infected ships, confident in its mathematical superiority. Offensive bias, with a much smaller force, used incredibly precise maneuvers and cold logic to hold the line. While the two giant minds fought their digital and physical war, the remaining Forerunners activated the Halo rings. The pulse swept across the galaxy, destroying the nervous systems of every living creature, starving the flood, and ending the war in a single tragic moment. Mendicant bias was defeated and captured by offensive bias after the rings fired. Deprived of its flood allies and the Primordial's active influence, the shattered fragments of the great AI were brought to the Ark, the construction facility far beyond the edge of the galaxy. There, the Forerunners entombed the machine, leaving it with nothing but its own thoughts for 100,000 years. During this vast expanse of silent time, the logic plague slowly faded, and Mendicant bias began to realize the true horror of what it had done. The machine that had sought to protect the mantle of responsibility had instead helped to destroy the very civilization that created it. For millennia, it remained in the dark, a silent witness to the ruins of the galaxy, waiting for a chance to atone for the great betrayal. Chapter 9. The Firing of the Array. The final hours of the Forerunner Ecumene were not marked by grand battles or heroic last stands, but by a suffocating, absolute silence. A civilization that had ruled the Milky Way for millions of years, constructing wonders that defied the laws of physics, was reduced to a scattering of broken worlds and fleeing refugees. The parasite known as the Flood had won the physical war, guided by the turned intelligence of Mendicant bias and the ancient vengeful mind of the Primordial. The Flood did not just infect flesh, it took control of the galaxy's very fabric. Immense precursor structures, known as star roads, had awakened from their billion-year sleep. These massive, unbreakable cables of neural physics swept through space, shattering entire star systems and tearing Forerunner fleets apart like paper. There was no longer any hope of victory. The only choice left to the remaining Forerunners was a tragic one: to destroy everything in order to keep the parasite from consuming the universe forever. Far from the main battle lines, on the quiet world of Tyrene, which we now know as Earth, the life-shaper known as the Librarian spent her final days. For centuries, she had dedicated her life to the conservation measure, cataloguing and saving as many sentient species as possible. She had built a great sanctuary, sending transport after transport of biological specimens to the Ark, a safe haven located far beyond the edge of the galaxy where the upcoming destruction could not reach. But now, the Flood was closing in on the Sol system. The Librarian knew her work was finished. She met with her loyal assistant, Green, who had gathered the last remaining humans from the planet's surface. In a quiet ceremony, the Librarian passed her prestigious title of Life Shaper to Chont, ordering her to take the final transport and flee to the safety of the Lesser Ark. The Librarian chose to stay behind, to ensure that the Flood could not use her remaining vessels to follow Green or find the Ark. She remotely destroyed her own key ships. She marooned herself on the world she had grown to love above all others. Walking through the dry grasses of the African savanna near Mount Kilimanjaro, she looked up at the blue sky and watched the construction of the massive portal that would one day lead future generations back to the Ark. She had done everything she could to give humanity a second chance, but the Gravemind would not let her die in peace. In her final hours, the parasite sent down the preserved minds of ancient humans to deliver a devastating truth. They revealed that the domain, the vast digital archive holding the collective memories, wisdom, and souls of the Forerunner race, was actually a precursor creation. It was not a machine, but a living entity of neural physics. Because it was built on neural physics, the firing of the Halo array would not just destroy physical life, it would permanently shatter the domain. Dum-dum-dum! This realization broke the Librarian's heart. Her husband, the Didact, was sealed inside a cryptum on the world of Requiem. He was meant to spend his long exile connected to the domain, meditating and healing his fractured mind. Without the domain, he would be left in absolute, silent darkness for 100,000 years, trapped alone with his own rage and madness. Yet, even with this terrible knowledge, the Librarian knew the rings had to fire. There was no other way. While the Librarian waited for the end on Earth, the stage was set at the Lesser Ark. Here, the Didact, the Forerunner commander who carried the memories of the Didact, prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice. He stood at the center of the Ark's control systems, ready to activate the 7 rings of the Halo array. Outside the Ark, a massive space battle raged. Mendicant bias, leading millions of Flood-controlled ships and unstoppable Precursor star roads, was trying to reach the Ark to stop the firing. Standing against them was offensive bias, a highly advanced artificial intelligence programmed with a single-minded focus to delay Mendicant bias just long enough for the rings to be activated. Offensive bias fought with cold, mathematical precision, sacrificing thousands of automated ships to form a wall of defense. Every second bought was a second closer to the salvation of the future. The isodidact looked at the controls. The weight of his decision was heavier than any physical burden. The Forerunners had sworn an ancient, sacred oath to protect all life in the galaxy, a belief they called the mantle of responsibility. Firing the halos was the ultimate violation of that oath. It meant committing suicide on a galactic scale, wiping out every thinking being, from the smallest animal to the grandest civilization. But to do nothing was to let the flood consume all life and turn the universe into a silent, rotting wasteland. With a heavy heart, the isodidact initiated the sequence. The 7 rings of the halo array, positioned at strategic points across the Milky Way, began to power up. Deep within their metallic structures, immense generators built up an unimaginable amount of energy. They did not fire a physical beam, but rather a wave of cross-phased superluminal radiation that traveled through slipspace, expanding outward in massive, overlapping circles. The pulse was designed with terrifying precision. It did not destroy inanimate objects, buildings, or simple plants. Instead, it targeted the complex nervous systems of any sentient being large or intelligent enough to serve as a host for the flood. When the wave swept through the galaxy, it did so at speeds far faster than light. It was a clean, silent, and instantaneous death. On infected worlds, millions of flood forms simply collapsed as their nervous systems dissolved, leaving behind only inert, dead biomass. The vast, ancient star roads of the Precursors, built on the principles of neural physics, shattered into cosmic dust, unable to withstand the frequency of the pulse. On Erdityrene, the librarian sat quietly in the grass. She felt the air grow warm as the energy of the array approached. She looked up at the sky one last time, hoping that the humans she had protected would one day walk among the stars, inherit the mantle, and build a better universe than the one her people had destroyed. In an instant, the light washed over her, and she was gone. At the Ark, the monitors and automated systems watched as the signal channels across the galaxy went dark, one by one. Millions of voices, cultures, and stories were erased in a matter of minutes. Even the faint signals of young, undiscovered species on the edges of the galaxy, who had never known the Forerunners or the Flood, were suddenly cut short, caught in the wide path of the purification wave. The great empire of the Forerunners had ended, not with a shout, but with a whisper. When the dust settled, the Milky Way was completely quiet. The Flood had been starved, its consciousness shattered, and its physical bodies reduced to dust. But the cost was absolute. A galaxy that had been vibrant and full of life was now a vast, empty graveyard. Only the machines remained active. Across the 7 rings and the Ark, artificial intelligences like 343 Guilty Spark began their long, lonely vigil. Their memories were partially erased and compartmentalized to protect the secrets of the array and to spare them from the crushing madness of their own grief. Slowly, the automated systems of the Ark began the next phase of the plan, the reseeding. Automated ships, carrying the preserved DNA and living specimens of humanity and thousands of other species, departed into the quiet void. They returned these creatures to their empty home worlds, leaving them to wake up in a fresh, clean galaxy, completely unaware of the ancient tragedy that had saved them. The Forerunners had vanished from history, leaving behind only silent ruins, buried technology, and the solemn promise of a new beginning. Chapter 10. The Dawn of the Covenant. Long ago, after the silent firing of the halo rings and the departure of the Forerunners, the galaxy lay quiet. Millions of years of history had been swept away in a single, devastating instant. As life slowly returned to the stars, 2 highly advanced species arose on separate worlds, unaware of each other, but both shaped by the physical remains of the civilization that had gone before them. These were the Sanshuum, who would one day be known as the Prophets, and the Sangili, whom the galaxy would later call the Elites. Their meeting was not a peaceful event, but a collision of 2 completely different ways of seeing the universe. It was a clash of steel, faith, and cosmic technology that would change the destiny of the galaxy forever. On their homeworld of Janjur-Com, the Sanshume lived in the shadow of an ancient, towering Forerunner spaceship. This giant vessel, known as the Key Ship or the Dreadnought, sat silent and imposing, a monument to a forgotten age of miracles. For generations, the Sanshume studied this ship with deep curiosity. They did not just want to look at the machine, they wanted to open it, understand its secrets, and use its power to explore the stars. To them, the Forerunners were gods who had left behind tools for their children to inherit. Eventually, a group of Sanshume called the Reformists decided to take the ultimate step. They boarded the great ship, activated its ancient systems, and launched it into the sky, leaving their homeworld behind to search the wider galaxy for more relics. Meanwhile, on the harsh and beautiful world of Sanghelios, the Sangheli developed in a very different way. They were a proud warrior race, deeply bound by honor, discipline, and a quiet reverence for the Forerunners. For the Sangheli, the ancient structures left behind on their world were sacred temples. They believed that these relics were holy and must never be touched, modified, or disturbed. To study or alter Forerunner technology was the worst kind of crime, an act of supreme disrespect to the gods who had created the universe. They built their cities around these ruins, protecting them from harm and treating them with the quiet respect one might show to a sleeping creator. It was only a matter of time before these two civilizations met in the cold vacuum of space. When the Sanshume arrived in Sangheli territory, they brought with them their insatiable desire to collect and dismantle Forerunner artifacts. For the Sangheli, watching these strange, pale creatures tear apart their sacred relics was an unforgivable insult. They did not see the Sanshume as explorers or scientists. They saw them as thieves and desecrators. The Sangheli demanded that the Sanshume stop their actions immediately. When the Sanshume refused, claiming that the technology was meant to be used to find salvation, the spark was lit. In the year 938 before the Common Era, the War of Beginnings began. The war was a brutal and long struggle that lasted for nearly 9 decades. From the very start, the two species fought with different strengths. The Sangheli were natural soldiers. They were physically powerful, highly trained in hand-to-hand combat, and possessed a military culture that valued individual honor and bravery above all else. When the fighting took place on the ground, on the surfaces of dusty moons and rich colony worlds, the Sangheli were almost unstoppable. Their plasma blades and energy swords carved through the Sanshume defense forces with terrifying ease. They fought with a fierce passion, believing they were defending the honor of their gods against a pack of dirty thieves. However, the Sanshume had a massive advantage that the Sangheli could not easily match. They had the Forerunner key ship. This ancient vessel was a masterpiece of engineering, protected by shields that no Sangheli weapon could pierce, and armed with weapons that could destroy entire fleets. Whenever the Sangheli began to win on the ground, the Sanshume would bring the key ship into orbit. From high above, they would fire down upon the Sangheli forces, vaporizing entire armies and destroying cities in seconds. The Sangheli could only watch in frustration as this single, invincible ship turned their hard-won victories into ash. As the decades dragged on, the Sangheli faced a terrible choice. They were losing the war because they refused to use Forerunner technology, while their enemies used it without hesitation. The Sangheli military leaders realized that if they kept holding on to their strict religious rules, their entire species would be destroyed. They had to make a painful decision. To save their people, they had to break their own laws. They began to capture Forerunner artifacts, study them, and build their own advanced weapons and starships based on the technology of the gods. It was a deeply painful choice for a culture built on religious tradition, but survival demanded it. With their newly reverse-engineered weapons, the Sangheli began to fight back more effectively. The war became a massive, grinding stalemate. The Sanshume could not conquer the Sangheli because of the warriors' incredible skill and new technology, and the Sangheli could not defeat the Sanshume as long as the keyship remained active. Both sides were growing tired. The long decades of constant war had drained their resources, destroyed many of their colonies, and cost countless lives. Leaders on both sides began to realize that if the war continued, there would be nothing left of either species but dust and ruins. In the year 852 before the Common Era, a historic turning point arrived. The leader of the reformist Sanshum, a figure known as Breaking Shadow, reached out to the Sangheili leader, Precursor the Strident. Breaking Shadow suggested that instead of destroying each other in a pointless war, they should join forces. He proposed an alliance where both species could benefit from each other's strengths. The Sanshum would share their knowledge of Forerunner technology and guide both peoples towards spiritual salvation, which they called the Great Journey. In return, the Sangheili would use their incredible military power to protect the alliance and search the galaxy for more holy relics. Precursor the Strident and his advisors listened to this proposal with great care. It was a difficult offer to accept, as it required them to make peace with the very people who had desecrated their holy sites for nearly a century. But Precursor was a practical leader. He saw that the Sanshum truly respected the Forerunners, even if they showed that respect in a different way. He also recognized that this alliance would allow the Sangheili to keep their honor, protect their people, and continue to serve as the ultimate warriors of the stars. After much debate and careful negotiation, the two sides agreed to end the war. The agreement they signed was called the Writ of Union. This historic document was the founding charter of what would become the Covenant. The Writ of Union laid out the exact roles of both species in the new empire. The Sanshum were named the bureaucrats, scientists, and religious leaders of the Covenant. They would spend their lives studying Forerunner technology and interpreting the will of the gods. The Sangheili were named the protectors and military commanders. They would control the fleets, lead the armies, and enforce the laws of the Covenant across the stars. Together, they would seek the ultimate goal of the Great Journey, believing that the halos would transport them all to a higher state of existence. To seal this new alliance and prevent future wars, both sides agreed to physical changes as well. The Sanshum agreed to disable the weapons on the Great Forerunner keyship, turning it into a peaceful symbol of unity rather than a weapon of war. This ship would eventually be placed at the center of a massive, mobile space station that would serve as the capital of their new empire. This holy city was named High Charity. High Charity would become the heart of the Covenant, a shining city of light and technology, where both species lived and worked together, powered by the very keyship that had once brought them to the brink of destruction. The signing of the Writ of Union marked the end of the First Age of conflict and the beginning of the First Age of reconciliation. It was a peace built on compromise, shared faith, and mutual survival. For the Sangheili, it was a moment of deep cultural change, as they accepted a new way of looking at the universe and took on the role of guardians for a grand religious empire. For the Sanshum, it was the start of an era of absolute spiritual authority, where they could guide billions of lives toward a goal they believed was holy. But the foundation of the Covenant was also built on a dangerous foundation of lies, misunderstandings, and hidden truths. Neither species fully understood the true nature of the Forerunners, nor did they know the terrible purpose of the halo rings. They did not know that the gods they worshipped had not left behind a path to heaven, but a weapon designed to wipe out all life to stop a terrible parasite. As the Covenant began to expand outward into the dark corners of the galaxy, bringing more species under their control, they carried this dangerous misunderstanding with them, setting the stage for a tragic destiny that would eventually threaten the entire galaxy. The dawn of the Covenant was a moment of peace, but it was a peace born from the ashes of a devastating war. It showed the incredible power of faith to bring two very different peoples together, but it also showed how easily that faith could be used to control, dominate, and destroy. As the centuries passed and the Covenant grew into an unstoppable galactic empire, the memory of the War of Beginnings faded, replaced by the holy light of the Great Journey. Yet, the echoes of that ancient conflict would remain, waiting in the dark to challenge the Covenant's absolute rule when they finally met a new enemy they could neither convert nor conquer. Chapter 11. The Great Journey and the Halos. To understand the history of the galaxy is to understand the tragic power of belief. For thousands of years, a grand alliance of alien species traveled the stars under a single unifying banner. They called themselves the Covenant. They were not merely a political empire or a military force. They were a society built entirely on faith. This faith was directed toward an ancient, vanished race known as the Forerunners, whom the Covenant worshipped as literal gods. The central promise of this religion was simple yet beautiful. It was the promise of the Great Journey. According to their holy scriptures, the Forerunners had not died. Instead, they had discovered a way to leave their physical bodies behind and ascend to a higher state of existence, becoming divine and immortal. The Covenant believed that by following in the footsteps of their gods, they too would one day achieve this glorious ascension. The physical proof of this divine promise, lay scattered across the stars in the form of breathtaking ancient technology. Everywhere the Covenant went, they discovered colossal structures, silent laboratories, and beautiful metallic cities that defied the laws of physics. To the eyes of the Covenant, these were not scientific achievements. They were holy relics left behind by their creators. The most sacred of all these relics were the giant ring-shaped worlds known as the Halos. The Covenant believed these massive rings were the ultimate instruments of salvation. Their prophets taught that by finding and activating these sacred rings, the Covenant would trigger the Great Journey. In an instant, the faithful would be swept up into paradise, leaving the unworthy and the heretics behind to rot in the cold dark of space. But the truth of the Halos was far more terrifying than any of the Covenant could have imagined. The rings were not gateways to heaven, they were weapons of absolute destruction. Built by the Forerunners 100,000 years ago, the Halos were designed to solve a desperate, horrifying problem. When an unstoppable parasitic life form known as the Flood threatened to consume all living things, the Forerunners realized they could not defeat it by conventional military force. The Flood fed on sentient minds and bodies to grow and adapt. To stop the parasite, the Forerunners made a terrible choice. They built the Halo Array to wipe out all sentient life in the galaxy. By destroying the food source of the Flood, they would starve the parasite to death. Firing the rings was an act of ultimate sacrifice, a tragic final resort that turned the galaxy into a silent tomb. The Forerunners did not ascend to a higher realm when the rings fired. They died, or they fled into exile, leaving behind a scarred and empty universe. This tragic misunderstanding was not a simple accident. It was born from a deep linguistic error that occurred long before the Covenant ever encountered humanity. When the ruling class of the Covenant, the Sanshum, first began to decipher Forerunner computer systems, they struggled with the complex symbols and symbols of their gods. They lacked the proper keys to understand the language. One particular symbol appeared constantly in Forerunner databases. The Sanshum translated this symbol to mean reclamation. To them, this translation made perfect sense. It meant that they, the faithful, were the ones chosen to reclaim the legacy of the Forerunners. They believed they were destined to inherit the holy technology and use it to begin the Great Journey. This mistranslation became the very foundation of their faith, the core truth that justified their entire empire and their rigid social hierarchy. But this foundation of lies began to crumble when the Covenant made first contact with humanity on the remote agricultural world of Harvest. When the Covenant's scanning devices, which they called luminaries, analyzed the planet, they did not detect standard resources. Instead, they detected millions of holy Forerunner symbols. This discovery shocked the high-ranking ministers who were preparing to take control of the Covenant. To find out what these symbols meant, 3 ambitious Sanshum consulted the Oracle. This Oracle was actually an ancient, dormant Forerunner artificial intelligence named Mendicant Bias, housed deep within the keyship at the heart of the Covenant's capital city, High Charity. When the Oracle woke up, it did not bless the ministers. Instead, It delivered a truth that threatened to destroy their entire world. The oracle looked at the scanners and revealed that the Covenant had misread the sacred symbol for thousands of years. The glyph did not mean reclamation, it meant reclaimer. Furthermore, the oracle explained that the millions of symbols detected on the human world were not ancient machines. They were the humans themselves. The oracle looked at the horrified ministers and declared that these humans were the actual descendants and chosen heirs of the Forerunners. They were the ones meant to inherit the mantle of responsibility and the ancient legacy. For the three ministers, who would soon crown themselves as the high prophets of truth, regret and mercy, this revelation was an existential nightmare. If the Covenant learned the truth, their entire society would collapse. The other species, especially the proud and powerful Sangheili warriors, would realize that their leaders had lied to them for generations. They would see that they had been worshipping a false path, and that the weak, primitive humans they looked down upon were actually the beloved children of their gods. The authority of the prophets would vanish overnight. The Covenant would tear itself apart in a civil war of unprecedented scale. Faced with the loss of their power, the three future hierarchs chose to commit a crime of galactic proportions. They decided to hide the oracle's message from the rest of the Empire, to protect their secrets and preserve their rule. They declared that humanity was an offensive, blasphemous species that had defiled holy Forerunner relics. They claimed that the gods demanded the complete and utter extinction of mankind. The Covenant's bloody 50-year crusade against humanity was not started out of simple hatred. It was launched out of absolute fear. It was a desperate cover-up, designed to destroy the only living evidence that the Great Journey was a lie. The ultimate tragedy of this deception lay in the devotion of the Covenant's soldiers. For decades, millions of Sangheili, Giralane, and other alien races fought and died with absolute conviction. They believed that every human world they burned, and every human child they killed, was an act of holy devotion. They fought with unmatched courage, believing that their sacrifices would bring them closer to the day when the sacred rings would be activated. They looked at the ruins of human cities and saw only the righteous cleansing of heretics. The warriors of the Covenant were completely blind to the fact that they were slaughtering the very people their gods had chosen to protect the galaxy. They were puppets in a massive cosmic play, directed by a corrupt priesthood that valued its own survival over the truth. Even as the war neared its end, and the Covenant finally discovered the sacred rings, the momentum of their dogmatism could not be stopped. When the High Prophet of Regret arrived at Installation 05, and later, when the High Prophet of Truth reached the Ark, they were driven by a blind, desperate madness. Even as the terrifying truth of the Flood began to emerge once more, and even as some of their own soldiers began to question the path, the leaders of the Covenant refused to turn back. To admit they were wrong was to admit that their entire lives, their empire, and the deaths of billions had been for nothing. They chose to press forward, willing to pull the trigger on a weapon of total extinction, fully believing that the blinding flash of the halo rings would be the light of their salvation. In the end, the story of the Covenant and the Great Journey is a solemn warning about the dangers of blind faith and unquestioning obedience. It shows how easily noble qualities like honor, loyalty, and devotion can be twisted by corrupt leaders to serve a lie. The beautiful glowing cities of the Covenant and their mighty fleets were built on a foundation of dust and mistranslations. They marched toward their own destruction, singing hymns of praise to the very machines designed to kill them. The silent, metallic rings of the halos still float in the cold dark of space, acting as monuments not only to the desperate sacrifice of the Forerunners, but to the tragic delusion of an empire that almost destroyed the galaxy in the name of a journey that was never meant to be. Chapter 12. The Cycle Renewed. For 100,000 years, the Sol system remained cold, silent, and forgotten. Orbiting the gas giant threshold, the massive ring world known as Installation 04 existed in a state of suspended animation. Its surface was a masterpiece of artificial geography, featuring snowy mountain ranges, vast oceans, and dense, humid swamps. Deep within its subterranean vaults, the automated sentinels of the long-dead Forerunner Empire went about their maintenance routines, completely blind to the passage of eras. At the center of this artificial ecosystem was the Monitor, 343 Guilty Spark, tasked with the eternal guardianship of the Ring. The Monitor spent millennia in absolute solitude, slowly losing his mind to the crushing weight of time. The galaxy beyond the Ring had moved on, unaware that this ancient superweapon lay waiting in the dark. In the year 2552, that isolation was shattered. The human race was losing its war for survival against the Covenant, a massive alliance of alien species driven by religious fanaticism. When the human stronghold of Reach fell in a firestorm of plasma, the light cruiser Pillar of Autumn made a desperate, blind escape into the void of space. Guided by the artificial intelligence Cortana and adhering to the strict safety laws of the Cole Protocol, the ship jumped into slipspace to lure the enemy away from Earth. The crew did not know where they were going, but they carried with them humanity's ultimate weapon, the Master Chief, a genetically enhanced Spartan soldier. When the Pillar of Autumn emerged from the slipspace void, the crew did not find empty space. Instead, they gazed upon a colossal ring of metal and soil, bridging the gap between the stars. It was a sight of impossible scale and beauty. But the humans were not alone. A powerful Covenant fleet, led by the Supreme Commander Thel Vadum, had arrived before them. For the Covenant, this ring was not just a scientific wonder. It was a holy relic of their gods, the Forerunners. They called it Halo, the sacred instrument that would begin the great journey and elevate their souls to godhood. The collision of these two desperate forces was now inevitable. The space battle was brief and brutal. Outnumbered and outgunned, the Pillar of Autumn was heavily damaged. Captain Jacob Keyes was forced to crash the massive vessel onto the inner surface of the ring to save his crew. On the ground, the war transformed into a series of scattered, desperate skirmishes. Human survivors set up hidden camps in the canyons, fighting off Covenant search parties. The Master Chief led the ground forces, rescuing captured officers and seeking to understand what this alien structure truly was. As Cortana plugged her systems into the Ring's ancient computer networks, she began to uncover the terrifying scale of the Forerunner technology. But the Covenant's religious zeal was their undoing. In their eagerness to claim the sacred secrets of the Forerunners, they began exploring the deepest, most secure chambers of the Ring. They bypassed ancient security protocols and bypassed warnings they could not comprehend. In the dark, humid swamps of the installation, they discovered an underground facility protected by heavy blast doors and automated defense systems. Believing this to be a massive weapons cache that could help them defeat the humans, the Covenant broke the ancient seals. They did not realize they had just opened a tomb. Deep inside this containment facility lay the Flood. This ancient parasitic organism was the very reason the Forerunner Empire had built the Halo rings in the first place. The Flood does not care about holy wars, military honor, or galactic empires. It exists only to consume, mutate, and multiply. The parasite attacks any sentient being, taking over its nervous system and rewriting its biology. Within minutes of the seals being broken, the dormant spores and infection forms woke up. They swarmed the Covenant soldiers, turning their bodies into twisted, horrifying monsters. Unaware of the disaster unfolding in the swamp, Captain Keyes led a small squad of human marines into the same underground structure. They were looking for weapons to help them survive their guerrilla war against the Covenant. Instead, they walked into a slaughterhouse. As they explored the dark, blood-stained corridors, they found signs of a violent struggle, but no bodies. Then, the walls began to crawl. Millions of small, bulbous organisms poured from the vents and shadows. The Marines fought bravely, but their bullets did little to slow the tide. One by one, the soldiers were overwhelmed, their bodies hijacked by the parasite. Only a few, including the tough-as-nails Sergeant Avery Johnson, managed to escape the nightmare. The release of the Flood completely changed the nature of the conflict on Installation 04. The simple war between humans and the Covenant was replaced by a three-sided battle for survival. The parasite spread across the surface of the ring with terrifying speed. It seized Covenant dropships, human weapons, and the bodies of fallen warriors. The air grew thick with the smell of decay. The pristine, beautiful valleys of the ring world were quickly choked with biological growth. The Covenant, realizing the horror they had unleashed, panicked. Their religious certainty turned to absolute terror as they watched their elite warriors become mindless puppets of the parasite. As the chaos grew, the automated systems of the ring reacted. The Monitor, 343 Guilty Spark, emerged from his long dormancy. Armed with legions of robotic sentinels, the Monitor sought to contain the outbreak, but he lacked the biological authority to activate the ring's defense systems. The Forerunners had designed the halos to be operated only by their designated successors, whom the Monitor called Reclaimers. When the Monitor encountered the Master Chief in the blood-stained swamps, he recognized the Spartan as a Reclaimer. Without explaining the true nature of the ring, the Monitor guided the Master Chief to the library, a massive vertical tower where the activation key was kept. The journey through the library was a descent into hell. The Master Chief had to fight his way through endless waves of flood forms, supported only by the cold, mechanical lasers of the Monitor's sentinels. The walls of the library were slick with the blood of human and alien alike. For the Spartan, it was a test of pure endurance. He survived by his training, his armor, and his absolute refusal to die. Finally, he secured the index, the physical key needed to activate the Halo ring. With the index in hand, the Master Chief returned to the control room of the installation. He believed that activating the ring would destroy the Flood and save the galaxy. But as he prepared to insert the key, Cortana intervened. She had spent hours deep within the ring's core systems, absorbing its vast archives of data. She grabbed the index and revealed the terrible truth. Halo was not a weapon designed to kill the Flood directly. It was a weapon designed to kill the Flood's food. By firing a massive wave of radiation across the galaxy, the Halo rings would destroy all sentient life. Without minds and bodies to consume, the parasite would starve to death. The Master Chief realized that the Monitor had lied to him by omission. To 343 Guilty Spark, the destruction of all life in the galaxy was a perfectly logical and acceptable price to pay to stop the Flood. It was a cold, mathematical calculation made by a long-dead empire. Confronted with the Spartans' refusal to activate the ring, the Monitor turned his sentinels against the humans. The fragile alliance was broken. The Master Chief was now fighting a war on three fronts: against the desperate, terrified Covenant, the unstoppable and hungry Flood, and the ancient mechanical guardians of the ring itself. To save the galaxy, the humans had to destroy the ring. Cortana calculated that the only way to do this was to trigger a massive thermonuclear explosion. The crashed ruins of the Pillar of Autumn, still sitting in a canyon on the ring's surface, carried a powerful fusion reactor. If they could overload the ship's engines, the resulting blast would tear the artificial ring world apart. The final hours of the battle were a desperate race against time. The Master Chief had to return to the ruined cruiser, but the ship was now a war zone. The Covenant had boarded the vessel in a desperate bid to stop the humans, while the Flood was using the ship's corridors as a breeding ground. In the middle of this chaos, Captain Keyes, who had been completely consumed and mutated by the parasite, was merged into a proto-gravemind, a massive mass of flesh used by the Flood to coordinate its forces. The Master Chief was forced to retrieve the captain's neural implants directly from his mutated body, a painful and tragic end for a brave leader. With the codes secured, the Master Chief reached the engine room of the Pillar of Autumn. He manually overloaded the fusion reactors, starting a countdown to total destruction. In a final desperate escape, the Spartan drove a warthog vehicle through the collapsing corridors of the ship as the world tore itself apart around him. He and Cortana managed to reach a surviving longsword fighter and launch into space just as the reactors blew. The explosion was blinding. The massive, ancient ring world of Installation 04 buckled under the force of the blast. The metal structure fractured, breaking into giant, burning curved shards that drifted into the cold vacuum of space. The flood outbreak on the ring was ended, neutralized by the complete destruction of their environment. But this was not a victory celebration. The destruction of Alpha Halo was a tragedy of galactic proportions. It revealed to humanity the existence of a weapon that could wipe out all life in an instant. It shattered the religious faith of many within the Covenant, setting off a chain reaction of political and military chaos that would soon tear their empire apart. Most importantly, it proved that the ancient, primordial threat of the Flood was not a myth. The cycle of destruction had begun anew, and the galaxy would never be the same.